The exemption statistics, which always put a bit of a smile on my face as I read them, to remind you all the number of applications we had to enter Trinidad and Tobago as at the 29th of July, our borders having been closed on the 22nd of March. So this is months later, was 5,539. What I can tell you all, and then we had granted at that stage 2,250 exemptions for persons to come in. If we then go to, let's say, the 31st of October as another good date, at the 31st of October we had 12,717 applications being made to enter Trinidad. We had granted exemptions to 6,972, so just under 7,000 exemptions. What that showed us is that there was a trend that was taking place at that stage. In addition to those who may have been stuck outside when the borders were closed at the end of March, there were others joining, making applications. We then began to realize by that stage there were those who may have lost their jobs, may have had different circumstances, who were nationals. The Prime Minister has always drawn our attention to the fact that there are 330,000 Trinidad and Tobago nationals out there, passport holders, who have the right to come to Trinidad and Tobago. So by that time, we had had that dramatic rise in the number of applications. What I can tell you all, as at I think when we met on the 20th of November, I told you all the number of applications had risen to 13,922. So that's on the 20th of November. What I can report today is a month later, as at this morning, the 22nd of December, we now have 17,211 applications. Compare that to the number on the 29th of July, and I use the 29th of July number as being a good figure to measure those who were stuck outside on the other side of the border when we closed it on the 22nd of March. As at today, we have 17,211 applications. We have granted 9,557 exemptions to enter Trinidad and Tobago as at this morning. That has risen, I can tell you, during the course of the day as we deal with more applications. So what we have seen is we've seen this trend, we've seen a number of changes, we've seen the dynamics and categories of persons change. I can also tell you all, added to that, are persons who have gone outside, because every time a CAL plane leaves the shores of Trinidad and Tobago to New York, Miami, Toronto, or Barbados, it is going with persons outside. And those persons, knowing that the borders are closed, are now adding to the lines of persons trying to get back in. And we've tried to manage that as well. Of course, we also had the phenomenon of students who wanted to leave in August. And we told them if the borders are still closed, there may be some difficulty. Fortunately, we believed about a month or so ago that we had taken care of the vast majority of our nationals who were stuck outside in March. And we were able to start allowing persons to come home in that category for Christmas. But you all would see, and the numbers tell a story of those increases in those who continue to try to come back in. But added to that are those who have gone out. And I get it, because I get a lot of email and messages of persons. Well, I just went out at the end of November. I went out for medical care. I want to now come home. But of course, we still have our prioritization. We have done the best we can. We put on the flights, and I'd like to thank the Ministry of Health, the other arms of national security who helped us to really have good turnaround, and we've stuck to the 10-day periods of being able to bring in flights, turn people in and out of the state quarantine facilities, the state supervised quarantine facilities, and to get that maximum uptake of persons now at just over 9,500 persons that we've been able to grant exemptions to come home as at today's date. There's another issue I'd like to just briefly address. The world saw what was happening, as we were just discussing before here, over the weekend in the United Kingdom. It started off with a promise of a Christmas and then a rollback, and they went up to their top tier where they basically had to shut down and lock down everything in the United Kingdom. Spinning very quickly out of that is what Dr. Paris Ram spoke about, that there seemed to be a variant, a mutation, in my words, of the virus and the effects that had. I looked on with some level of amazement at how other countries reacted to it. We saw some European countries take a decision to say no travel from the United Kingdom for the next 24 hours. being part of the Prime Minister's team of managing this with our scientists and our doctors over the period of time, I thought at the time, well, that's not much use. But you have to do something, because of course the virus could have already entered, and a 24-hour ban really does nothing, knowing the cycle of the virus. After discussion with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health, the CMO and his team earlier this week, you all saw Trinidad and Tobago's reaction. We have no direct flights coming from the United Kingdom, so we didn't have to ban any flights from the United Kingdom. What we did is we said, as you all are aware, over the last month, persons coming into Trinidad and Tobago require PCR, a negative PCR test 72 hours before arrival, really 3 days before arrival. Is not down to the hour and the minute. So it's 3 days before arrival. That remains in place for everywhere, including the United Kingdom. We also then took a decision to increase anyone coming from the United Kingdom, whether they're coming indirectly through another country, they would be required to go into 14 days quarantine, regardless. So whereas other persons right now, it's a 7-day quarantine period, you're retested and then you're allowed to go home and complete your quarantine for the next 7 days. Now anyone who has been in the United Kingdom over the previous 14-day period, you're going to, after producing your negative PCR test, be put into quarantine for 14 days, and then we will test you again before you come out of that period. That's our current position. It is subject to change, as you all have seen throughout the management of this. The third issue I'd like to deal with are our farm workers in Canada. And again, I smiled as I saw people bawling and screaming, and some people that really are late on the bandwagon, because the government had been working very closely with the government of Canada, and the government's approach has been Ministry of National Security, the Ministry of Labour, who's in charge of the farm workers. We actually have somebody from the Ministry of Labour in Canada as the liaison officer for our farm workers who are outside, as well as the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs. And what I can announce today is the last 2 flights that came back from Canada, including one yesterday, we did begin the process of repatriating our nationals who went out as farm workers. There were 2 categories, those who were out before we closed the borders, and then you all would recall there was a large group that were actually threatening to sue the government to go out and work, and we warned them, and at the time they signed indemnity and waiver agreements that they would go out of their own accord, and if they were outside and they wanted to return, they would be subject to the government's border management system at the time. What I can say is the government has been working with the Canadian government. The Canadian government granted them extensions. They set up a specific process to grant extensions to allow our nationals who are outside there working on the farms not to become illegal. And we have now begun the process of full-scale repatriation of those who want to come home, because even in getting the information from the Ministry of Labour and the Canadian government, there is a category of our nationals who are outside that we told them we're bringing everybody home, and I'm about to tell you all the process, but there are still about 90 to 100 odd who said, well, at this time we don't want to come home. Of course, that's always subject to change, as we learned with the category of cruise workers on cruise liners a few months ago. We are having our first fully dedicated repatriation flight of our nationals who are working on the farms in Canada on the 28th of this month, the 28th of December, and we're using a CAL flight, and we'll bring back, I'm hoping, the full amount, 150 workers on that flight. We're going to have a dedicated facility or facilities for them under state quarantine, where we will deal with it and then move very quickly at the end of that 10-day period to hopefully the next flight, which I am hoping would have brought back all of our workers at that time. The government has been working on this for some time. Of course, we were also dealing with all the other statistics that I gave you all a short while ago. If I may just very briefly, Prime Minister, just touch on the energy sector, because we've been managing that very, very tightly. From the word go, the Prime Minister at the early outset had said that we needed to keep that industry up and alive. From national security, we drove the process. I've been in constant contact with all of the CEOs of upstream, downstream, etc. And it's really pleading with people to follow the protocols. What happened in Perenco was we have 2 categories, national workers and non-nationals. The non-nationals who have to enter the country, we have very, very strict protocols. And in fact, I can tell you all that I've turned away 3 plane loads of workers who were flying into Trinidad within the past few weeks after consultation with the CEOs of the multinational companies, because they arrived here at Piarco and they did not have their negative PCR tests. And I took a decision after consultation that Trinidad and Tobago, the rules are for everyone, and we were not going to allow a breach, because if people came in positive, they then went out on a rig, they would then potentially infect the whole rig, and that has, so we turned away 3 plane loads of foreign nationals trying to come into Trinidad and Tobago who did not adhere to the protocols. Unfortunately, from what we've gathered with the Parenco incident, it was our own nationals. We've asked nationals who are to go offshore, quarantine yourself before going offshore, stay away, stay in an isolation bubble for 14 days before going offshore. Of course, that didn't take place. God alone knows what the persons did, but they took the infection offshore into a rig, and it's very difficult when you're now in that environment, which is a close-knit environment. So again, just to let you all know, this is how we've been managing our energy industry, and we will continue to do so as best as we can. But ultimately, Prime Minister, it comes down to personal responsibility on behalf of everyone. And I'd just like to add to the Prime Minister, my cabinet colleague, and all of the doctors, thank you to all of the healthcare workers, all of the workers in national security, police service or defense force or immigration workers who continue to work all hours of the morning when we have these flights come in, or prison service, or customs officers, and all of the other frontline workers, the fire services who are out there doing yeoman's duty and service. But it really comes down to personal responsibility, and that's the message I'd just like to add, piggyback on the Prime Minister's message and my colleagues and the healthcare personnel, because last night at 9 o'clock, I was the one Dr. Trotman was referring to, who went to the grocery, and I was completely shocked, as I was telling the team a little before, to see the behavior at 9 o'clock at night, where I thought it should be a safe period. There was no social distancing taking place. Thank God people were wearing masks. But it really does come down to the personal responsibility. Also, it was my experience of church a few weeks ago, and seeing that people were not adhering to the 50% rule. These regulations have been very thoughtfully thought out. And I'm just asking people in this time, don't let your guards down, and continue to do what you must from a personal level. Thank you very much, Prime Minister.